Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling something a little different. We're going to be exploring the concept of nothingness.
Nothingness.
It's something that has puzzled philosophers for centuries, and we're going to try and unpack why it's such a fascinating and frustrating idea.
Yeah, it is intriguing how many cultures have these creation myths that kind of revolve around it. Like I was thinking about the Beatles' Yellow Submarine,
Oh, yeah.
and the creature in there that's kind of like a vacuum cleaner sucks up everything and creates this void.
Right.
And then by turning on itself, it accidentally creates this whole world again.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea, and it kind of makes you wonder, what if things just started vanishing around as like, poof, an apple's gone,
Yeah.
and then another one's gone, and then the table that they were sitting on is gone, and then a house is gone, and can we just keep subtracting until there's literally nothing left?
Yeah, that's the core of what's known as the subtraction argument, this thought experiment that really pushes the limits of how we can imagine things. But before we even get there, we have to confront a question that's haunted philosophers for ages.
Oh, I know this one.
Yeah.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah,
It's so simple, but it feels like it goes deeper than any kind of science experiment can really answer.
yeah, exactly. You can't tackle it with observations because to observe anything, you need an observer, and that already assumes something.
So where do we even begin? Is it just like this philosophical chicken and egg problem?
Well, there's a few different approaches. Some philosophers, like Descartes, suggest we start by assuming nothing exists, and then we only allow things back in if we can prove they're really there.
Okay, so a super strict bouncer at the door of existence, but
Yeah.
isn't that setting the bar like impossibly high? How do you even prove anything without already assuming some things exist?
Yeah, and that's exactly the problem. And so other thinkers have said, well, actually, maybe it's more reasonable to start with what we experience,
Right.
which is a world full of stuff.
Okay.
And maybe the burden of proof should be on proving things don't exist.
Okay, so two very different starting points. Does that lead to totally different conclusions about why there's something?
Well, it gets even more complex because you've got someone like Peter Van Inwagen who brings in a statistical argument.
Okay.
He says, imagine there are infinitely many worlds and only one of them is totally empty.
Right.
If you picked a world at random, wouldn't you be overwhelmingly likely to end up in a world with something in it?
Statistically, yeah, that does make sense. But then wouldn't our specific world with all of its kind of weird quirks also be statistically improbable? Like, what are the odds that we'd end up with a planet with talking cats and internet memes just by chance?
That's exactly the point that Van Inwagen is making, is that the sheer improbability of any specific world, even one full of stuff like ours,
Right.
raises questions about how we even think about the odds of existence versus nothingness.
So even using statistics, we're kind of left scratching our heads why there is something. Have any philosophers just straight up said no to nothingness, like it can't exist?
Absolutely. Yeah. Victor Hugo in Les Miserables really passionately argued against nihilism.
Okay.
He insisted that nothingness has no substance, that everything is something. So it's like the very concept of nothing depends on the idea of something to even make sense.
It's a powerful statement,
It is, yeah.
but it still leaves us with this tricky question of, okay, well, what is this nothing that we're trying to wrap our heads around? Is it just like a big empty void?
It seems intuitive to think of it as a simple empty space, like
Yeah.
the mathematical concept of an empty set. But when you look at how philosophers have actually thought about nothingness, it gets way more complicated.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
So what are some other ways that people have tried to imagine nothing?
Well, for example, medieval philosophers got really into the idea of different kinds of empty worlds. And they'd say, like, well, is a world with a center of gravity different from one without, even if they're both empty?
So even emptiness wasn't seen as this one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, they were really focusing on the potential within nothingness, even if nothing actually existed. And then later on, as science evolved, philosophers started wondering about the role of natural laws.
Okay.
Could there be an empty world but with different laws of physics, like a world where gravity works differently or light acts in a completely new way?
Whoa, so are we talking like an infinite number of empty worlds, each with their own kind of weird set of rules?
It's a wild idea.
Eh?
Then you have someone like John Hale who throws a real wrench in the gears.
Okay.
He questions the whole concept of contingent laws of nature, so the idea that the laws could have been different. He thinks that maybe that's a leftover from thinking about a god who kind of sets the rules of the universe.
So he's saying that maybe there aren't any laws in the way that we think about them,
Yeah.
but that things just behave according to their own inherent nature.
Yeah, that's the kind of radical shift he's proposing. And if that's true, then it totally changes how we even think about an empty world.
Right.
Because instead of it being defined by these external laws, it's defined by the potential of, well, nothing itself.
Okay, my brain is officially doing backflips now.
Yeah.
We've gone from a single empty world to potentially infinite ones, and now we're questioning the very idea of laws that might define those worlds.
Yeah.
So where do we even go from here?
Well, next you can explore another puzzle that comes up when we think about something versus nothing, and that's the problem of explanation.
Okay.
Can we really explain why there's anything at all? So to tackle that question of why anything exists at all, maybe we should bring in Gottfried Leibniz,
Okay.
a big name in the world of possible worlds. He had this idea that everything that could possibly exist is constantly like vying for a spot in reality. The things that are most cooperative, that fit together the best, those are the ones that become real.
So it's kind of like a giant cosmic puzzle, where only the pieces that fit together perfectly make it into the final picture.
That's a great way to put it. But here's where it gets a little tricky. If existence favors simplicity and harmony, wouldn't that mean that an empty world is actually the most likely outcome?
Wait, you're saying the simplest solution is just to have nothing?
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense logically, but it just feels so counterintuitive because we experience a world bustling with stuff.
Exactly. That's the paradox of simplicity. And even Leibniz himself realized this, like his own idea taken to its extreme seemed to actually favor nothingness.
Right.
It's like the very principles that explain how things exist also undermine the possibility of their existence.
So are we stuck in this explanatory trap where any attempt to explain existence just like circles back to nothingness?
It's a tough one because we usually explain things by pointing to something else, mountains formed by plate tectonics or rain coming from clouds.
Right.
But when it comes to explaining existence itself, we can't point to something outside of existence.
It's like asking, why is there a universe? And not being able to say because there's a bigger universe that made it.
Exactly.
Because then you would just ask, well, why is that universe there?
You got it. And David Hume realized this problem. He said, we can explain individual events, but not the totality of existence itself.
So we're left with this fundamental mystery.
Yeah.
We can break things down and explain the parts, but the whole picture is always going to be just out of reach.
It seems that way, and it raises the question of can we even use the same kind of explanations for the whole as we do for the parts? This is the problem of the fallacy of composition. Just because something's true for individual components doesn't mean it's true for the entire system.
Right, like saying every brick in a house is small, so the house itself must be small.
Exactly. So Van Inwagen offers another interesting distinction that might help here.
Okay.
And that's the difference between concrete and abstract entities.
Okay, let's unpack that. What's the difference there?
So concrete things are part of the causal order of the universe.
Okay.
They have a location in space and time you can interact with them. Things like trees, rocks, planets, even ourselves. Abstract things, on the other hand, they don't have a physical location, and they don't directly cause things to happen.
So things like numbers, ideas, concepts, maybe even those laws of physics we were talking about earlier, those would all be abstract.
Exactly. And so Van Inwagen's point is that when we ask why is there something rather than nothing, we're really focusing on concrete stuff, the stuff that makes up the physical world around us.
Right. It's the things that we can see and touch and actually experience that really grab our attention.
Yeah.
But it makes me think about where the line between concrete and abstract gets a little fuzzy. Like, what about things like shadows or holes or cracks? They have a location, but are they really made of stuff?
That's a great point. And those are what philosophers sometimes call immaterial concrete things.
Okay.
They exist, they have boundaries, but they're not material in the same way a rock or a tree is. Think of a crack. It has a shape and a location, but it's not made of crack stuff. It's more like the absence of something.
So they exist, but they're not quite as real as a physical object. It's making me wonder if there are maybe like degrees of being or existing.
Now you're getting into some deep philosophical territory, and there's this idea of ontological pluralism, which suggests exactly that, different levels of being.
Okay.
Someone like Chris McDaniel would say that a whole is less real because it depends on the object it's a whole in.
Right.
Its existence is kind of borrowed, not quite as fundamental as the object itself.
So reality might have layers, with some things being more fundamental or more real than others? This is blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, and it kind of leads us to another dilemma, the contingency dilemma.
Okay, hit me with it. What's the contingency dilemma?
Well, it basically asks, Can we really explain contingent truths, the things that happen to be true but could have been otherwise?
Okay.
And William Rowe framed this dilemma really nicely. He said that contingent truths can't be explained by other contingent truths,
Okay.
because that would just be circular reasoning. And they can't be explained by necessary truths, things that must be true, because those can only explain other necessary truths.
So you're saying that the things that we experience every day, the things that make up our reality, might not have an explanation at all.
It's a possibility that Rowe's dilemma highlights. The things that seem most real and tangible to us might actually be the hardest to fully explain. But of course, philosophers always love to try to find ways around a good dilemma.
I'm holding on tight. What are some of the escape routes here?
Well, one thought is that maybe we need to kind of broaden our idea of what counts as an explanation.
Okay.
Maybe there are types of explanations that go beyond just strict logical deduction from necessary truths.
Okay.
For example, we might use inferences to the best explanation, which are based on inductive reasoning and evidence, even if they don't offer, like, absolute certainty.
So it's like saying we might not be able to prove why the dinosaurs went extinct, but we can still come up with really strong explanations based on the evidence we have.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting concept, truth makers. David Armstrong argued that for any true statement, there has to be something in reality, a truth maker, that makes it true.
Okay, so like if I say this table is brown, the truth maker would be the actual brown color of the table.
Precisely. He thought these truth makers kind of connect our statements to reality
Uh-huh.
and make sure they're not just random claims. But here's where things get tricky again when we think about the empty world.
I can see where this is going. If the empty world has nothing in it, then where are the truth makers for statements about the empty world?
That's the puzzle that Armstrong wrestled with.
Right.
And he eventually proposed that the empty world could borrow truth makers from the actual world.
That would-
So we can say a tree doesn't exist in the empty world because trees actually exist somewhere.
So it's like saying that even though the empty world has no coffee, we can still talk about coffee not existing there because coffee exists in our world.
Exactly. It's a way of kind of grounding statements about nothingness in the reality of somethingness.
Right. Of course, not everyone agrees with this, but it shows how complex the relationship is between language truth and nothingness.
This is really blowing my mind. We've gone from why things exist to what it even means for something to be something. And now we're talking about how language relates to nothingness.
Yeah.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, believe it or not, our exploration takes us next into the realm of logic,
Logic.
where we'll see that even logic itself has something to say about the empty world.
Logic? That seems like the most abstract thing imaginable.
It is.
How does logic get tangled up with the question of whether anything even exists?
Well, it's a fascinating connection. It shows how deeply interconnected these different areas of philosophy are. Classical logic, the system of reasoning that we typically use, actually presupposes that something exists.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to need you to unpack that one. How does logic assume something exists?
Well, in classical logic, universal quantifiers like everything or for all, they imply that there's at least one thing for that statement to apply to.
So, for example, the statement, everything is identical to itself. Well, that implies that there's something out there that can be identical to itself.
So even a basic logical principle like the law of identity assumes there's something there to have an identity.
Exactly. And that creates a problem when we try to apply classical logic to the empty world.
Right, because if there's literally nothing, then those universal quantifiers would be referring to, well, nothing.
Yeah.
And that could lead to some very strange and potentially contradictory conclusions.
Exactly. So classical logic doesn't really know what to do with the idea of nothingness.
So does that mean we need a whole new kind of logic to deal with nothingness?
Well, some philosophers have proposed alternative systems that try to address this very issue. One of those is called free logic.
Free logic, what makes
Yeah.
it so free?
Well, unlike classical logic, free logic doesn't require every name or term to have a corresponding thing that exists.
Okay.
It allows for empty names,
Uh-huh.
like Pegasus or Santa Claus, without causing the whole system to fall apart.
So I could say Santa Claus lives at the North Pole,
Ah.
and free logic wouldn't immediately say, but Santa Claus doesn't exist, so your statement is meaningless.
Exactly. It lets us talk about non-existent things without automatically assuming that those statements are false.
That's pretty cool. So does that mean that free logic solves all the problems that classical logic has with the empty world?
It addresses some of the challenges,
Okay.
But even free logic has its limitations
Right.
and its critics.
Of course, philosophers are never going to fully agree.
Exactly. Some argue that it doesn't fully escape the problem of assuming something exists,
Hmm.
even if it's not tied to specific names. So it seems like even logic, which is supposed to be all about pure reasoning, can't fully escape this question of whether anything exists.
So are there any other attempts to reconcile logic with this idea of an empty world?
Well, we can look at W.V.O. Quine's approach.
Okay.
He was a hugely influential philosopher, and he kind of proposed a compromise. He said, what if we modify our understanding of logical theorems, those statements that are supposed to be universally true,
Yeah.
instead of requiring them to hold true in all situations, including the empty world,
Uh-huh.
maybe we only require them to hold true in worlds where there's actually something.
So it's like saying the rules of logic apply except in the special case of nothingness.
Exactly. It's a way of acknowledging the unique challenges posed by the empty world,
Okay.
without having to throw out the entire system of classical logic.
That's a clever workaround. It's like saying the rules of chess apply except when there are no pieces on the board.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the practical side of Quine's approach, because he's saying essentially that for all practical purposes,
Right.
we can use classical logic without worrying too much about the empty world.
Right.
Because, well, we don't live in an empty world.
So logic has a way of adapting even to something as mind-boggling as nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
It can bend the rules a bit to accommodate this ultimate philosophical challenge.
It does seem that way. And this brings us back to that thought experiment that we started with the subtraction argument.
Right, the idea of things vanishing one by one until we're left with absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Does that really hold up when we examine it closely?
It's an idea that's sparked a lot of debate among philosophers. Thomas Baldwin, who explored this argument, said that if we can imagine a world with a limited number of things, then we can imagine each thing disappearing until we're left with an empty world.
Right, it's like a jar of cookies. If you eat one cookie at a time, you'll eventually end up with an empty jar.
Exactly. But as you might imagine, things get more complicated when we consider the possibility of an infinite number of things.
Right, because even if you ate a cookie every second for the rest of your life, you'd never finish an infinite jar of cookies.
Precisely. So the question is, can the subtraction argument work even when we're dealing with infinity?
Does the argument break down when we introduce infinity?
It depends on how we define those concrete entities that we're subtracting. If, as Penelope Matty argued, every single thing also implies an infinite number of sets containing that thing, then we can never truly reach zero no matter how much we subtract.
So if even a single apple implies an infinite number of sets containing that apple, then we can never really get to nothing.
That's the challenge that Matty's view presents. But Baldwin offered a different definition of concrete entities to try and get around this problem.
Okay.
He focused on the idea of indiscernibles, things that are completely identical.
Like two perfectly identical snowflakes.
Exactly. Baldwin argued that concrete things can have exact duplicates,
Okay.
while abstract things like sets can't. This allowed him to classify sets as abstract, avoiding that problem of infinite sets popping up everywhere.
So by redefining what we're subtracting, he managed to salvage the subtraction argument,
That's the idea.
even when dealing with infinity.
But of course, even Baldwin's revised argument has its critics.
Of course, because philosophers love to debate every little detail.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the objections to his approach?
Well, one criticism is that his definition of concrete relies too heavily on the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic properties.
Remind me again, what's the difference between those two?
Sure. So intrinsic properties are the ones a thing has all by itself, regardless of anything else.
Okay.
Think shape, size, mass. Extrinsic properties depend on the object's relationship to other things, like its location or who owns it.
So the shape of an apple is intrinsic, but the fact that I own the apple is extrinsic?
Exactly.
Okay.
And some philosophers would say that the line between these two types of properties isn't always so clear-cut. So if Baldwin's definition of concrete hinges on this distinction, his whole argument about the subtraction argument might be on shaky ground.
So even what we're subtracting is up for debate.
Yeah, it seems like every time we try to nail down this concept of nothingness, it slips away from us.
It does. I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's like our whole philosophical worldview influences how we approach this idea of nothing.
That's a really profound insight. Nothingness isn't some isolated concept. It's interwoven with our entire understanding of reality. And this brings us back to one of the key figures in the history of Western philosophy, Parmenides.
Ah, yes. Parmenides, the champion of being and the ultimate opponent of nothingness. Wasn't he the one who argued that you can't even think about nothing because the very act of thinking about something means it exists in some way?
You got away. Parmenides believed that reality is fundamentally a unity,
Okay.
a single indivisible whole.
Uh-huh.
He thought any attempt to talk about nothingness or non-being was inherently contradictory.
So for him, nothingness wasn't just like an absence of things. It was a logical impossibility.
Exactly. He believed what is not cannot be thought or spoken about
Mm-hmm.
without running into contradictions. This led him to a monistic view of reality, the idea that everything that exists is ultimately part of one unchanging eternal being.
Okay. I can see how that would rule out an empty world. If everything is part of one big unified thing, then there's no room for nothingness to sneak in.
Hmm.
But how did other philosophers respond to Parmenides' kind of radical ideas?
Well, not everyone bought into his arguments. The atomists, for example, challenged Parmenides' monism head-on. They said, no, actually, the world is made up of tiny, indivisible particles moving around in empty space.
So it's a philosophical battle royale.
Yeah.
One side saying reality is completely full.
Yeah.
The other saying, no, there has to be empty space for things to move and change.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this debate has shaped Western philosophy ever since, with thinkers constantly wrestling with this relationship between being and non-being, fullness and emptiness.
So what happened next in this clash of the philosophical titans?
Well, Aristotle, a student of Plato and one of the most influential thinkers of all time, jumped into the ring with his own unique perspective.
Okay.
He rejected the atomists' full embrace of the void,
Okay.
but also wanted to move beyond Parmenides' strict monism. This led him to develop the concept of plenism.
Okay, what is that all about?
So plenism is the idea that the universe is completely full.
Okay.
No empty spaces whatsoever.
Oh,
However, Aristotle still believed that motion was possible
okay.
because things could move by displacing each other like a fish swimming through water.
So it's like a giant cosmic puzzle where all the pieces are perfectly interlocked, no gaps or empty spaces.
That's a great analogy. Aristotle's plenism was a way to reconcile the apparent fullness of the world
Right.
with the fact that things could move and change.
But didn't Aristotle's teacher Plato try to combine atomism and plenism using those cool geometric shapes, the Platonic solids?
He did. In his dialogue, Timaeus Plato presented this story where the atoms were represented by the Platonic solids, each with its own unique properties.
Okay.
And he envisioned these solids kind of fitting together perfectly
Right.
to form the building blocks of the universe.
It's a beautiful idea, using geometry to explain the structure of reality.
It is.
But didn't it run into some problems?
It did. Even Aristotle pointed out that the Platonic solids can't actually fill space completely without leaving gaps.
Oh, right. It's like trying to tile a floor using only pentagons.
Yeah.
You'll always end up with some awkward spaces that you can't fill.
Exactly. So Plato's attempt to combine atomism and plenism,
Right.
while aesthetically pleasing, ultimately failed to account for the apparent fullness of the universe.
So are we back to Aristotle's plenism? A world with no empty spaces, but with objects moving by displacing one another?
It seemed that way, and this idea held sway for a long time. Aristotle's influence was huge. His ideas shaped Western thought for over 1,000 years. But as with all philosophical ideas, eventually plenism faced its own challenges and revisions.
Okay, I'm eager to hear about the cracks in the plenum.
Oh.
What led people to start questioning Aristotle's ideas about nothingness?
Well, one interesting development came from the Stoics,
Yep.
a school of philosophy that emerged in ancient Greece.
Uh-huh.
And they agreed with Aristotle that there were no vacuums here on Earth. But they believed that there must be a void surrounding the cosmos.
So a cosmic vacuum, a vast emptiness beyond the boundaries of the material world.
Precisely. They thought this void was necessary to allow the universe to kind of breathe and expand. It's a fascinating idea that actually anticipates some modern cosmological concepts.
It's amazing how these ancient thinkers were grappling with ideas that kind of resonate with modern physics.
It really is, and another challenge to Aristotle's plenism came from Hero of Alexandria, an engineer and inventor who lived in the 1st century AD.
Okay.
He argued that while naturally occurring vacuums might not exist, it is possible to create them artificially.
So is he talking about things like suction cups and pumps?
Exactly.
Devices that seem to create empty space?
Yeah. Hero believed that nature has this inherent horror vacuum, this fear of emptiness,
Right.
and that objects kind of resist the formation of vacuums.
Okay.
However, he thought that with enough force, it's possible to overcome this resistance and create artificial voids.
It's like saying nature prefers things to be full and packed together. But us clever humans can find ways to trick nature and create a bit of emptiness.
Yes, and this idea of artificial vacuums set the stage for some really important scientific discoveries that would eventually challenge Aristotle's plenism in a big way.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What were these discoveries that really shattered the idea of a completely full universe?
Well, these breakthroughs came in the 17th century
Okay.
and were led by scientists like Evangelista Torricelli and Blaise Pascal.
Okay.
Their experiments with barometers, those devices that measure atmospheric pressure,
Yeah.
provided really compelling evidence for the existence of vacuums.
So the empty space at the top of a mercury barometer,
Yeah,
where there's seemingly nothing but a vacuum, that was a major blow to Aristotle's plenism.
exactly. Pascal, in particular, argued that there's truly nothing holding up the mercury in a barometer.
Okay.
It's being pushed up by the weight of the atmosphere.
Right.
Not pulled up by some mysterious force in the vacuum. This was a radical departure from the prevailing view that nature abhors a vacuum.
So science was starting to reveal the reality of nothingness,
Yeah,
even though philosophy had been wrestling with this concept for centuries.
it really is remarkable, and these discoveries led to a real shift in how nothingness was conceived.
Okay.
It was no longer just a philosophical abstraction or a logical puzzle.
Fine.
It was a concrete phenomenon that could be observed and measured.
This is a major turning point.
Yeah.
But didn't some thinkers still resist this new understanding of nothingness?
They did. René Descartes, a towering figure in both philosophy and science, was among those who rejected the idea of vacuums.
Okay.
He believed that matter and extension were one and the same,
Okay.
meaning that there couldn't be space without matter.
So for Descartes, even if there was seemingly empty space, it had to be filled with some kind of invisible matter,
Yeah.
a subtle substance that permeated the universe.
Exactly. He, like many others at the time, couldn't shake the idea that something must exist everywhere. Right.
Even if it was undetectable to our senses.
It's really fascinating, this tension between the philosophical intuition that something must always exist and the emerging scientific evidence for the reality of nothing.
It is, and this tension continued to play out in the development of physics, especially with the arrival of Isaac Newton's theory of gravity.
Ah, yes. Newton, the man who explained why apples fall from trees and planets orbit the sun.
Exactly.
How did gravity enter the picture?
Well, Newton's law of universal gravitation, while a triumph of scientific explanation, seemed to require action at a distance,
Okay.
something that troubled many physicists at the time.
Okay, wait, action at a distance. You mean the idea that objects can exert forces on each other without actually touching?
Exactly, and this seemed to require some kind of medium,
Okay.
a subtle substance permeating all of space,
Okay.
to transmit these gravitational forces.
So we're back to this idea of an invisible substance filling the void. But this time it's not just to avoid emptiness, but to actually explain how gravity works. Precisely. And this hypothetical substance was called ether,
Okay.
and it played a big role in 19th century physics. Scientists imagined ether as the medium that transmitted not only gravity, but also light waves.
So ether was like this ultimate multitasker.
Yeah.
The glue holding the universe together and the highway for light to travel on.
Exactly. But as you might expect, this idea ran into some problems.
Of course.
As physicists tried to really pin down the properties of ether,
Ah,
they ran into more and more difficulties.
right.
The more they tried to explain with it, the more complex and contradictory its properties became.
So it was starting to feel like cosmic duct tape trying to hold together too many different things.
So that's a great way to put it. And eventually, the idea of ether was dealt a fatal blow by the theory of relativity developed by Albert Einstein in the early 20th century.
Okay.
Einstein showed that we didn't need ether to explain gravity. Instead, gravity is a consequence of the curvature of space-time itself.
Okay. Einstein always makes my brain hurt a little bit, but I think I'm following. So instead of needing ether to explain gravity,
Yeah.
Einstein showed that gravity is just a result of the way space and time are shaped.
Exactly. It was a revolutionary insight that eliminated the need for this mysterious space-filling substance.
So does that mean the idea of nothingness was finally vindicated? Is the universe really just a bunch of stuff floating in a vast emptiness?
It might seem that way,
Okay.
but the story of nothingness takes another really unexpected turn with the development of quantum field theory in the 20th century.
Quantum field theory, here we go down the rabbit hole of modern physics again. What does quantum field theory have to say about nothingness?
Well, according to quantum field theory, even a perfect vacuum, completely empty of all matter and energy, isn't truly empty.
Wait, so even in the most pristine emptiness imaginable, there's still something there?
That's the mind-blowing conclusion of quantum field theory.
Wow.
According to this theory, the vacuum is teeming with virtual particles, fluctuations of energy that pop in and out of existence.
Virtual particles, so things that both exist and don't exist at the same time my head is spinning.
Yeah, it's a bizarre concept.
Right.
But it's central to our understanding of the universe at its most fundamental level.
Okay.
And what's even more remarkable is that these virtual particles can have real, measurable effects on the world around them.
So even nothingness can influence the world around us.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like saying that the empty space in a room can actually affect the objects in that room.
Exactly. And some physicists, like Lawrence Krauss, have even argued that these quantum fluctuations in the vacuum might be the source of the universe itself.
Wow.
It's like this something from nothing scenario.
So we've gone from fearing the void to harnessing the power of the vacuum to create the entire universe. That's quite a philosophical journey.
It really is, and it highlights this remarkable evolution in our understanding of nothingness.
Right.
What started as a philosophical puzzle
Uh-huh.
has become a scientific phenomenon that might hold the key to the origin of everything.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far. We've explored the history of nothingness from ancient Greece to modern physics.
Yeah.
We've encountered philosophical dilemmas,
Right.
scientific breakthroughs, and just some mind-bending concepts along the way.
It really has been a journey.
It has, but I have to ask, what are some of the key takeaways for you? The things that have really stood out in this exploration of nothingness?
I think for me, it's really fascinating how nothingness has kind of gone from this source of existential dread to a potential wellspring of creation.
Yeah.
We think about the quantum vacuum, once seen as this ultimate abyss, now it's understood as this dynamic realm full of energy and possibility. It
Yeah.
might even hold the key to the origin of the universe itself.
It's like we've learned to embrace the void not as like an ending, but as a beginning. But it makes you wonder, hasn't nothingness also played a big role in how we understand our own human experience, our place in the universe?
Absolutely, yeah. Thinkers like Blaise Pascal, especially after this really profound mystical experience, that he had shifted their focus from the kind of scientific side of nothingness to its existential implications. Pascal was captivated by this human experience of finitude. Our awareness that our time is limited, that we're just tiny specks in this vast universe.
So nothingness became kind of a mirror reflecting our own mortality.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the vastness of everything and the smallness of ourselves.
Oh, and that kind of existential angst that you're describing is all over the works of thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, who saw the very existence of anything as this meaningless accident,
Yeah.
a source of bewilderment.
That's a really heavy thought.
It is.
It's like saying the fact that we exist at all, that there's something rather than nothing, becomes more of a burden than a comfort.
Exactly. It kind of challenges our desire for order and meaning and purpose
Right.
in a universe that might ultimately be indifferent to all of that.
So how do we even begin to cope with this unsettling awareness of nothingness? How do we deal with that existential vertigo?
Well, Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher who really wrestled with these questions, offered a really interesting perspective. He suggested that maybe why is there something rather than nothing
Yeah.
isn't really a question that can be answered directly.
Okay.
Maybe it's more like an expression of awe, a prompt to see the world as this incredible miracle.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's not about finding the right answer, but about kind of shifting our perspective to just marvel at the fact that anything exists at all.
Yeah, that's the heart of Wittgenstein's point. He believed that this question, even if it doesn't have a definitive answer, can push us to see the world differently, to recognize the sheer wonder of existence.
So instead of fearing nothingness, we might learn to kind of appreciate its role in shaping how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly, and it brings us to kind of one final thought.
Okay.
The question of whether animals experience nothingness.
Animals. Wow, I've never considered that. Do they contemplate the void? Do they have existential crises?
Well, Heidegger believed that animals don't experience nothingness in the same way that we do.
Okay.
He thought that this actually limits their capacity for reasoning and understanding negation.
Like you say, like a cat can't think there's no tuna in my bowl
Yeah.
because it doesn't grasp the concept of no or absence.
That was his view.
Okay.
But there's actually quite a bit of evidence from animal behavior that suggests that they can understand and respond to absences.
Okay.
For example, experiments have shown that animals can get anxious or fearful when a familiar stimulus is suddenly gone.
So maybe animals do have a basic grasp of nothingness, even if they don't write philosophical treatises about it.
Yeah, it's a possibility, and it challenges that kind of human-centric view of nothingness
Right.
that Heidegger was putting forward, maybe perceiving absences, noticing when things are not all. There's just a fundamental part of how any conscious being navigates the world.
This has been an absolutely mind-blowing journey. We've explored nothingness, from ancient philosophy to quantum physics, and it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
It's a topic that never ceases to amaze. We've seen how philosophers and scientists have tried to define it, explain it, even tame it. But ultimately, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, remains this really powerful source of wonder and mystery.
Yeah, it's a question that's definitely going to stay with me for a long time. And to everyone listening, I really encourage you to kind of keep pondering this deep question, delve into the works of some of these thinkers that we talked about, and explore these mysteries of existence with curiosity and an open mind.
And remember, even in the face of nothingness, there's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to wonder about.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the void. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop wondering.